All right, I believe this thing is on. Let's see. All right. It is Thursday, January 8th. So this is our second weekly status meeting of 2015, and we are super excited because Backdrop CMS will be released on January 15th, which is a week from today. Based on our past history of release dates, it'll probably be around midnight California time next week. We've got a handful of issues that we'd like to get done, nothing that's a release blocker. Since last week, we've made a bunch of progress, so we're going to just talk about that today. We have a section at the top of this meeting for updates from the PMC. This is if any issues run into problems and need to have conflict resolution, we'll talk about it as the PMC, and then we'll make an announcement in this part of the meeting to the more general Backdrop public. We haven't had any problems like that recently. We also don't have a very big PMC, so we're working on trying to get the product out the door and then try and get some more people to flesh out our community here. First things first, let's talk about this product. With the release next week, we're trying to figure out how we're going to deal with dealing with pull requests to different versions. So what we're going to do is we're going to create Backdrop 1.0.0, and we're going to create two other branches that we're going to be doing development on. We're going to have 1.0.x, which is where we're putting any bug fixes that need to come out right away. And then we're going to create a, or leave the 1.x branches is where any of the new features are going to go. So depending on what it is you're working on, you're going to need to file your pull request against a different branch. We're going to try and create some documentation that'll make it a little bit clearer which branch your pull request should be against. And one day when we get some automation set up for GitHub, we'll probably try and automatically close pull requests that are filed against the wrong branch with a friendly message saying you need to file your pull request against another branch, and maybe some instructions on how to quickly move the change you've made from one branch to the other via Git. So we'll see. We know right now it's going to be a little yucky just because we're about to start this. We haven't done it yet, but we'll get that process cleaned up a little bit in the future. About extra releases, we decided last week on our release schedule. We're going to release Backdrop 1.1 on May 15th, Backdrop 1.2 on September 15th, and Backdrop 1.3 on January 15th. So far, we have a list of features we want in 1.1, but 1.2 and 1.3 are still kind of up in the air depending on how fast we can get our first set of features into 1.1. So we'll have a official announcement for what comes in each branch when we start working on it, and that'll be kind of where we're directing most of our focus for the next release. So in terms of longer term than this first year, January 15th, 2016, we're going to reevaluate the release schedule we did this first year. This first year, we're going to do one release every 4 months. Depending on our momentum, the number of core committers, how fast things are going, we might start releasing every 3 months in 2016. We might also reevaluate how Backdrop 1 has done and see if we want to release a Backdrop 2 early next January to see if we have any major problems or any features that need to get in or something that might require an API change. So we're going to kind of take a look at how the project is progressing as well. Originally, we'd anticipated a 2-year major release cycle, but we'll reevaluate the end of Backdrop 1 and see how that's going based on all of the activity. So what's left for 1.0.0, which comes out next week? We have, since last week, fixed the last Drupal security issue. So this was the problem with image styles. There was a potential denial of service attack where somebody could regenerate all of your images, all of your image styles at the same time. And in Drupal 7, they implemented a fix that included adding a particular token to the end of your request, and if Drupal got the token, it know that the request came from Drupal and it was valid to generate the image. We didn't like that solution because it ended up breaking a bunch of sites that had inserted images into content and had those requests hard-coded without the token on them. So in Backdrop, what we've done is we've implemented a different solution. I think there's an issue in the queue. I think it's issue 180. Let's see. That has a more detailed explanation of what we actually did. Here we go. It's actually issue 358, where this past week Nate went and read through all of the previous suggestions that were made on the Drupal.org issue, found one he thought he liked, and we adapted that for Backdrop. So we have a solution that will solve the problem for most use cases and hopefully not break any contrib projects or sites in Drupal 7 that have their images inserted into content. We also have been making a bunch of progress on the list of commits that have been made to Drupal 7 since the last release. So this is meta issue 420, which I've been working on. I have 4 active pull requests against that one to try and get issues in 10 at a time. 2 of them have been committed since last week, which is great. So we've got 20 of those fixes in. I've got 2 of them that need work that I'll work on today. And then I think I only need to create 1 more. There's like 12 remaining patches that haven't yet been applied and aren't in a pull request. And I'll get that done today. And this, I think, as soon as we get this issue in, we have a bunch of other stuff that's kind of waiting on patches being applied easily. Like, we don't want to move files around until we're sure there aren't any patches that are needed against them. So I think we're getting really close on all of the Drupal 7 cross-ports that need to be updated. Also, before I move on to other things that we're working on in Backdrop, we did get an email from David Rothstein, who is the current Drupal 7 maintainer, asking us how we were handling security problems for Drupal, for Backdrop, and ideally how we can kind of coordinate between security releases for Drupal and Backdrop. This is something we've been thinking about before. You might have heard us mention the fact that we have a budding security team at Backdrop, and the people who are working on Backdrop security team are also working with the people who are on the Drupal security team. So we have been thinking about it. This past week, we created a bunch of other infrastructure that we needed to support our security process in Backdrop. We have set up a new page on the Backdrop primary website that talks about how security issues should be reported, that we've got a security email address now that you can email us reports to, and we have an RSS feed, so if you want to subscribe to security issues that might come out for Backdrop, you can do that on our website as well. Obviously, right now, there aren't any yet. We haven't released yet, but we did want to make sure we had all of this in place to make sure that everyone would stay secure after the initial release. So that's some kind of big things that we needed to take care of, and we were able to do in the last week. We got some great feedback from suggestions from David Rothstein. I think we implemented all of them since then. So kudos to Nate for setting most of that up. Okay, so other things we're working on. We had a list of major bugs, things that would prevent the release of Backdrop. I think most of those have been resolved, so we don't have any release blockers there. We do have a bunch of minor bugs that we're working on cleaning up, and we'll get in as many of those bug fixes as we can before next Thursday. They all require, obviously, significant testing to make sure that the bugs are actually fixed and that they aren't causing any other bugs. Since we're so close to release, we don't want to risk breaking a bunch of stuff. But we are pretty close on that as well. And then bug fixes can also go into point releases. So if we don't get all of the bug fixes done, I mean, there's obviously thousands of bugs in Drupal. We've inherited most of those bugs in Backdrop. We're not going to get all of them done. But we will try and get them done iteratively in the point releases as they come out. So they don't need to hold up the release, but we will release them as soon as we get them fixed. We have a handful of blocks and layouts follow-up issues. This is kind of our big killer feature, the one thing that Drupal doesn't have yet. We've got a handful of follow-up issues from that. The one thing that we've made a bunch of progress on since last week is getting a bunch of CSS and markup changes implemented. The big thing here is that all of the classes for layouts are starting with the L- prefix. And this will do 2 things that make it pretty good in Drupal 7. All of the elements in your layouts usually have IDs, and we're targeted with IDs. We're trying to remove the accessing of those elements by IDs because that presented some problems with the way you write your CSS. If it was accessed with an ID once, in order to override it, you had to also access it with an ID. And in addition, it'll help front-end developers coming to the world of Backdrop, where we have this separation of what your theme does and what your layout does, identify if you're building a layout, all of those classes start with L dash. They live in your layout template. All of the style sheets that affect your layout are going to target those L classes, and those go in your layout. So your style sheets in your layout are the ones that handle your layout, target your layout classes. And then if you have parts of your layout that need color, right, those will go in your theme. So I think that it'll help kind of people understand that separation between layout and style. That's something that's happening in kind of the front-end world in general. There's a whole philosophy of SMAX that like separates your layouts from your styles. We're doing that in Backdrop in a more physical way, where the templates are actually not part of your theme, and neither is the style sheets that control them. So having those classes go into layouts, I think, is going to be super helpful, or the class names of the prefixes. So that's also done since last week, which is great. Let's see, for views, I haven't been following all of the stuff that's been going on in views since last week, but I do think that we did remove both the Who's Online block and the Who's New block. These were blocks that we felt were most useful if you were running forum module, which has also been removed from Backdrop. And it was, something that I used, I think, back when I had Drupal 5 websites, but I haven't used them recently because I always ended up building views anyway. We talked to a bunch of other people who said they never used it, and we're like, what's the point of maintaining this piece of custom code when you have views in core? People could build a view if they wanted a Who's Online or a Who's New block. So we removed those in the hopes of not having to maintain that chunk of non-view custom code. We have two other block views that have not yet been converted to the recent content view and the recent comments view. Those both have views in Backdrop, but they don't have upgrade paths yet. So we're going to leave the custom code in core until we get the upgrade path for the view, and we can swap that at any time. That's not an API blocker. So we'll just, whenever we get those ready, we'll remove the custom code so you don't have to support it and replace it with the view. In terms of our administration pages, we have both replaced the admin people page and the admin content page with views. And the reason those are really important is because those have an integration with views bulk operations, and so there are actions that are like publish this node or give this user this role that needed to be created so that we could remove the old custom actions that were in Drupal 7 and replace them with the views bulk operations equivalent of those actions. So we wanted to get those done before the initial release, and those are both done and in, so we're looking good on that front. And then in terms of the rest of our views conversions, the only thing left is the pages that are generated by views. So that would be node and taxonomy term. These are things that I feel pretty strongly about in terms of usability. Like, we want people to not have to override those pages with a view. We want people to just edit the view. But they're also, we can put in those changes at any time. We can replace the node page and put in a view and provide an upgrade path. So not a release blocker. So those are kind of the next things on my list, but we need someone to work on them. I think there's pull requests for both of them. Both of them have, actually, I'm not sure anyone's worked on taxonomy term at all. So that one might not even have a pull request for it. But I know the node one has a pull request and needs an upgrade path. So obviously that's the sticky part there, is getting that upgrade path in. We can't just copy the config file, which was going to be the easy part. Instead, what we need to do is actually just write it out, because in the future we're going to have additional upgrades that change the config file. And so if it's not in the state we intend it to be first, if it copies it and then it tries to change it and that change can't be made because the file copied already contained it, that's going to be problematic. So there are some instructions in there on how to get those upgrades done, but it's much harder than just building the views. So let's see, where are we in this agenda? Views stuff. So yeah, views is looking good. We're ready for release, stuff coming lately. Config management, we don't have any release blockers. We have had a couple of people testing it. I found one bug related to config management that was from July or something, and I haven't been able to recreate it. I'm a little bit nervous. We haven't been getting more bug reports. I mean, that's amazing. It seems like everything's working, but I have a feeling that we're going to be getting bug reports soon, and we're going to be fixing stuff throughout the 1.0.0 or 1.0.x cycle as people start actually using it and seeing what's coming up. But so far, I mean, the kinds of things we've been doing with it has been perfectly fine, but it would be great if we could have some more hands-on experience with it to actually prove that it is as worthy as we think it is. So that's great. Another thing, I added a new item in this list since last week is a section for improving backwards compatibility. Obviously, our biggest selling point right now is that Backdrop is really close to Drupal 7, and we're trying to make it as easy as possible to port sites that are currently on Drupal 7 to Backdrop. And as part of that process, we've had a couple people write blog posts about what it's like to port modules, and we found some functions that were changed early in Drupal 8 or even later in Backdrop that don't exist. And so when you put in a module and you turn it on, you get this undefined function call. So we have a Drupal.inc backwards compatibility layer file, and we've been putting wrappers for all of these change functions into that file. So if you just grab a Drupal 7 module and throw it on your site, you should be able to turn it on and get it working with a minimal amount of effort. Like adding a line to your info file is acceptable. Moving functions around in files and what have you is not. So we're trying to keep the amount of work you have to do in order to get a Drupal 7 module working on Backdrop to a minimum, which means that we're putting in a whole bunch of backwards compatibility layers into this Drupal.inc file. Our plan right now is to leave the Drupal.inc file in place through all of the Backdrop 1.0.0 release cycle. And at the end of 1.0.0, we'll remove that file. So by then, we're assuming people are building sites on Backdrop, not moving them from Drupal. But we will reevaluate that decision, obviously, at the end of 1.0.0 and see. We'll try and get some statistics on whether people are using that compatibility or not, and if we should remove it. But hopefully the modules will be far enough along by then that they can be written for Backdrop and not for Drupal. But we'll see how that goes. So we've got some improvements for backwards compatibility since last meeting too. I added a section into this agenda for things that we're working on in 1.0.x, which are bugs that need to be fixed, and things that we're working on in 1.1.x. So these are new features that we want to roll out. Obviously, we're not working on any of these things right now because we're working on getting the first release out. But just for those of you who are curious of what we have planned for 1.1, we've got a built-in rich text editor. We're not calling it a WYSIWYG editor because in Drupal/Backdrop land, you aren't going to see what you get because you're looking at it in an admin theme and you're building it out in a box that's not necessarily the right size. We think WYSIWYG would encompass like the whole page, and that's not quite what we're talking about. So we're calling it a rich text editor because we're giving the people to put HTML or rich text into a body field. So we're trying to kind of set the right tone there with the terminology, but we want to get that in. It's something that Nate worked really hard on for Drupal 8, and it's kind of silly that Backdrop doesn't have that. So we're going to get that done pretty soon. And other things, we're going to kind of go through the top 10 modules that are used on Drupal and make sure we get most of those into core. So the first two we're targeting are Token and Path Auto. There's obviously a bunch of field modules and stuff that we also want to get in there pretty soon. So we're going to put this on the list for maybe 2 or 3. So that's what we're looking at right now. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that we're working on all the time. The biggest thing that I've been focused on lately is trying to get our style guide changes done. We have some designs for them we got last night, which look pretty good. They're not done. We have Ronnie Norwood also working on it for us. We've got another set of designs coming tonight. We're going to see, depending on how crazy the style guide changes are, how much of those are safe to get in for 1.0.0. It could be, if it's a drop button style, we can put that in, that's no problem. But if it's something like a drastic change to our admin theme, we'll have to wait, and we can put it in 1.1 or 1.0.x or whatever. We can put it in later. We just don't want to run the risk of breaking anything by making too large sweeping changes. So we'll see what we get, we'll see how fast we can get implemented, and we'll see how dangerous it is. And then we'll decide which branch it goes on. We also have a ton of user experience improvements. We've got a new issue tag UX. If anyone runs into user experience problems or wants to work on user experience problems, you can either tag an issue or search for issues with the tag. It's not an official GitHub label like some of our other ones, like marking an issue as a bug. We're just using square brackets and then the letters D and X in there to indicate, or U and X to indicate user experience. We also have a DX tag. in the issue title, which is for developer experience, and that's where we're marking most of the things that are adding backwards compatibility layers. And if you find anything that you're working on you feel is stupid, I do this all the time. I'm like, oh, that's stupid. Why does that work that way? I'll go create an issue and tag it with DX and be like, developers have a better experience if we did this. So there's a bunch of those issues in the queue too. Let's see. Other things we've got going on that aren't Backdrop the project. Our number one update server for Backdrop CMS. Last week at the last meeting we announced that we have an update server. All it does right now is return a, what is it, a 405 error or whatever it is that is not implemented. And so Backdrop the software listens for that not implemented error and won't throw an ugly error in your website just because there's no update server. So we kind of just bought us a little bit more time to create the update server. We're obviously going to need to do that here in the very near future, but we couldn't release the software with it showing a big red error saying that Drupal was not up to date because it was checking with Drupal servers. So we fixed that, bought us some more time there, and we're going to go ahead and work on the update server next. Let's see. We are also working on the API website. We've got change records being created over there. We've got some documentation being created over there. I have a to-do to port the module that's on, or sorry, the theme that's on Backdrop's primary website over to the API site. It has some formatting that's super useful for documentation pages, but it has some formatting for the main navigation that doesn't really work on the API site, so we've got to fix that. That's kind of a to-do on my plate, is to get that in there. We also have change records. We've been making some more changes to Backdrop in the last few days, so I know we've got a bunch of people who created a bunch of change records. We have a handful of new ones that we need to have created. Obviously, it's not super urgent, but the more accurate our change records are when we release, the easier it's going to be for people who are porting modules to actually consult the API site, get a accurate version of what's been changed, and be able to carry on about their way. So we'll get those updated pretty soon as well. And then some of the change records that are on there just need another review. I think we've had a pretty good job of them being stubbed out based on our issues, but we might need to go through and make sure everyone has code samples before and after, and that sort of thing. Okay, so something else that we need is official GitHub service. So if you create a Backdrop module or you create a Backdrop theme, we want you to be able to edit your GitHub project under settings, and it says like what kind of project it is, and it's got options there for like, this is a jQuery plugin. We want to have an option there that says this is a Backdrop extension, whatever, and then you check the box. And then BackdropCMS.org's primary website can then index all of those projects that have that box checked. So it'll give us an easy way for people to search for modules and themes that are made on Backdrop, but made for Backdrop, but hosted on GitHub. And so they aren't having to search GitHub for everything, because it's really hard to know, like, who is the definitive owner of this project? Like, is this one is it actually for Backdrop? Was it for Drupal? So having a way to do that would be super useful. And then we're going to have the official Backdrop projects also create a node on the primary Backdrop website where you can put things like links to the issue queue and all of that stuff. So if you check the box, it's an equivalent of a Drupal sandbox project, and if you create the node on Backdrop's website, it's an official project. And we'll also have a more clear documentation about how that works too after we make it work. All right, so other things. Primary website now has our logo and fonts on it. So that was something that had been bothering me, that we'd had a logo for a long time but hadn't updated our actual website with our logo. So we got it on there. I think the first round of design updates is done. We need a mobile navigation on it. Right now it just kind of prints the menu out at the bottom of the page, which is less than ideal. And we have designs for mobile navigation, but everything else I think has been implemented. And then all of these other parts of our flagship site, like adding a showcase site, the find modules, themes pages, a service directory, jobs listing, those will wait until we have things to show. So as soon as we have the GitHub service, we'll be able to build the modules and themes pages. As soon as there are sites running Backdrop, we'll build a showcase. As soon as there are people trying to hire people for Backdrop, we'll build a job site. So we'll get to those as needed. But we have plans for them. We just aren't there yet. Okay, so every Thursday after this meeting, We usually have a little mini sprint. We'll meet on IRC and we can talk about what we're working on, what you need help with, what you have questions about. You can also tweet at us at Backdrop CMS. You can send us an email. We put up a contact form on our website. So if anyone has any questions, getting a hold of us is pretty easy. But we try and do a bunch of work together on Thursdays just so that we can make some progress and you can have hands-on assistance with whatever it is you're working on. And in terms of upcoming events, I did get my first request today to speak at a Drupal event in 2015. I was invited to go to Drupal, what's it called? Sand Camp. Drupal Camp San Diego. It's called Sand Camp. We were offered to do a training, but I don't think it's at the end of January. I don't think we're going to have enough time to write enough material to do a training on Backdrop, so we're probably going to nix that one. But we will do a session, maybe even a 2-hour session that involves a bunch of demo. We're going to start porting Backdrop, CMS.org's primary website, from Drupal to Backdrop, and I think that would be a really cool thing to show people. Like, this is what's involved in terms of moving a Drupal 7 site to a Backdrop site. Here's how you check your modules to see how much work's going to be involved in importing them. This is what you're going to need to do to your theme, and kind of walk through that process. And I think after we've done it, we might be able to do an abbreviated version of it in an hour. So maybe we can do like our standard why Backdrop, like why should you care talk, and then an hour of like, okay, if you do care, this is how. So the why Backdrop and the how Backdrop might be a good combo. So I got that request from Susan this morning. I need to talk to Nate about it and figure out our schedule. But I think that sounds like a really fun thing to do when we actually have something to show people, rather than talking about it and just show it. So I'm pretty excited about that. Again, we don't usually go to Drupal camps unless we're specifically invited, because there is a little bit of tension in the Drupal community around Backdrop, and we don't want to feel like we're showing up and telling people what they should be doing instead. But if a community says, hey, we want to know about Backdrop, come talk about it, we will come and talk about it. So if you want us to talk at your camp, please invite us, because we aren't going to offer otherwise. So that's all I had for the meeting today. Thank you, Adam, for joining. I know I just kind of saw you show up and then just kept talking, but I appreciate having an audience.
Yeah, thank you for presenting.
Great. But yeah, so there's also some people watching this video right now, so thank you for watching. If you have any questions, you can tweet at Backdrop CMS or send us an email or find us in IRC. Yeah, I think I'm really excited about Backdrop coming out soon. I really want to use it. So every day I'm like, I want to use it. Oh wait, I should work on it first. I want to use it. No, I need to fix this thing first. Next week I can use it. This week, stay in the code. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to having the release out. I also really like our idea of, if it's not in it, next version, we're still releasing anyway. I'm really looking forward to the first release so we can kind of start proving that to people. That's kind of the opposite of how Drupal works. So, and that's kind of a big piece of why we are not Drupal anymore. So, yeah, it'll be good to start moving on. So, Adam, since you're here, do you have any questions or anything you want to discuss?
Well, yeah, I do. I do have a question about kind of the cross coverage between Drupal and Backdrop.
Okay.
You had mentioned the upgrade path from, or not upgrade path, but backport, I guess, from Drupal modules over to Backdrop.
Yeah.
And how you intend for us to eventually write modules specifically for Drupal, or specifically for Backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just kind of wondering if there's any way of keeping that cross coverage in place, because writing a module for Drupal, writing it for Backdrop, you have to maintain twice as much.
This is the biggest question, I think, for everyone is, I maintain Drupal modules. I don't want to maintain two separate sets of code, like one for Drupal, one for Backdrop. I have a handful of Drupal modules, so I'm in the same boat. The problem is not really between Drupal and Backdrop. The problem is really between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. It's gotten to the point where you do have to maintain two separate pieces of code for your Drupal 7 version of your module and your Drupal 8 version of your module. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to maintain one version of the code for Drupal 7 and Backdrop. However, there are caveats to that. Like, I have a bunch of modules that do one thing, and that's like provide a block, and that block might be like FlexNav, or maybe it's social media icons or whatever, but it's a very simple module that just provides a block. A module like that can exist in its same state for both Backdrop and for Drupal because of this backwards compatibility layer we have in there. You need to add a line to your info file. You might need to add some, default config for your settings forms for that module or whatever that Drupal will ignore because it doesn't know what to do with the JSON files. Backdrop can read them in and find them, however. So where you keep that code is up to you. If you want to, you have your code already in the Drupal repository. If you want to keep it there because it's easier for you to maintain it there, that is perfectly fine. What we don't want to do is rely on Drupal's infrastructure to support Backdrop projects. So if you ever feel like you're not going to support the Drupal project anymore, we want it off of their infrastructure just to be respectful of the fact that they have to pay for that and maintain it and all of that stuff. And so there are projects that will allow you to keep that code on GitHub, which is free and usable for everyone, and sync it between GitHub and Drupal. I think I even there's an issue in our queue about this, and I put a link in there, and there might even be a page on backdropcms.org with a link in it. I forget what it's called every time I have to talk about it. But there's a project that'll let you automatically sync your GitHub repository with your Drupal.org repository using Git, which is good. Now, if you have a module that is more complicated than just providing a block, something like Flag, for example, it has its own database tables, it has its own settings, it has a ton of stuff associated with it. In a Backdrop world, you're going to want that module to use config. And in a Drupal 7 world, it can't. It's storing all of its stuff in the database. So you can make that Drupal 7 module work on Backdrop exactly the same way as it works on Drupal 7. This is what we call a Backdrop compatible module, where it still stores all that stuff in the database. And you can turn it on, you can use it exactly the same way you would in Drupal 7. But you aren't going to be able to deploy those configuration changes on a Backdrop site like you would your content types or other things in Backdrop that are using CMI. So in that case, that Backdrop compatible module is very similar and can live on Drupal.org, and it will stay there for forever. But if you want this Flag module for Backdrop to work on Backdrop using CMI, it's going to need to be rewritten to use CMI. You're going to have to remove the database tables and save the stuff in config and read it out and all of that stuff. And at that point, we're calling that now a built for Backdrop module. Like, that's where you go through and you replace all of the Drupal functions with Backdrop functions. And what we're expecting will happen, and I've seen this happen already in Drupal 8, is that modules will start to get one maintainer that's responsible for the Drupal 7 branch and one that's responsible for the Drupal 8 branch. And I think that's kind of a natural progression of things where you have someone who's an expert in how things work in Drupal 8, and you don't want them to have to worry about the stuff that you're dealing with in Drupal 7. You can say, okay, you do Drupal 8 stuff and I'll do Drupal 7 stuff. I imagine that same thing will happen in Backdrop, where you'll have some people who don't care about Backdrop and aren't interested in doing whatever it is that we're doing over here. And you have some people who are, the same way about what's going on in Drupal 8. And so you'll have one person who wants to maintain Flag module for Backdrop and one person who wants to maintain Flag module for Drupal. And probably what will happen is the code will fork just like the Backdrop project has forked. In an ideal world, the module maintainers will still talk to each other. So you have some security issue that comes out on Drupal, you'll also be addressed on Backdrop or vice versa. I don't know how that's going to work in reality. What I imagine will happen is that we'll get a different version of these modules in the long term. Drupal 7 is obviously, it has an end of life. Who knows how far away that's going to be. But what we're planning on doing in Backdrop land is trying to support this. It can work in both places, kind of, for as long as that lifetime of Drupal 7. But for the future of Backdrop, Backdrop's going to be moving much faster than Drupal. Maybe we'll be on Backdrop 5 by the time Drupal 7 is end of life. Who knows? We'll see what happens, what the community wants to do. It may end up just being Flag module for Backdrop is different than Flag module for Drupal because it moved faster away from what it was originally, and it has its own maintainer. Maybe someone new will step up and say, I want to support Backdrop or this module for Backdrop because I have it on my sites and I use it a lot. So we don't really know. It's going to be we're trying to make this initial transition as easy as possible for people, but it'll be up to the community and the maintainers to decide what they want to do with their projects long term.
So just to make sure I have this right, you can write the same module using the same code base for Backdrop and Drupal, just as long as you have the Backdrop config, then it would be compatible unless you have tables in the database, and then you would have to do a Backdrop-specific module.
In theory. We've only tested this with a handful of modules so far. And what we're trying to do is, as we notice like functions that are missing, we build in that backwards compatibility layer. It's not going to be complete. There's definitely, like, porting a module is not going to be as simple as one line in your info file, although that might work for some modules. There's always going to be like, oh, this one function needs to be changed in this one way. But our goal in terms of doing this is making a port from a Drupal 7 module to a Backdrop module be like an hour as opposed to a week, or I don't know, rules module is supposed to take like 6 months or something for Drupal 8, right? That we want to make it as easy as possible to get ported. So we're not going to get everything. There's a lot of code in Drupal. There's a lot of code in Contrib. And we're going to try and address as many of these issues as we can going forward. So I would imagine that most of these first sites that are built using Backdrop will probably port modules and throw them in the Backdrop Contrib repository and say, this is just how I did it. And whether those modules end up being maintained there or just like for use there is up to the people who created them and the original creators of the module on Drupal. Like if you go to their issue queue and say, are you interested in supporting this for Backdrop, and they say no, then that module's going to need a new maintainer in Backdrop land, and it might live in the Backdrop repository and become something completely different. So yeah, it'll be up to the community to decide how they want to handle each project.
All right.
Definitely not an easy answer, but that's where we're at.
Let me think. And the other question I think I have is, so you're going to be basically updating by pulling a GitHub repo, or maintaining your own separate repo?
So this will also be up to each developer. I do not update my Drupal project by pulling from a GitHub repo, although that is an option. The way that I manage Drupal is that I have like a completely detached Drupal project that doesn't know anything about Drupal's Git history, that starts at like 0.0 as like I have installed Drupal, 7.20 or something. And then over time, I just re-download a tarball and replace core, right? And then I'll update it to 734 or whatever it is. I will do the same thing with Backdrop, where I will download a tarball and it'll start at 0.0, and then I'll have like a local Git repo for my project. And then over time, I'll just do the same thing. I'll download again, download again. Ideally, we'll be able to do that with Drush. At some point, we'll get Drush support. We've talked to the Drush maintainers, and they said they're fine if Drush supports Backdrop as long as they don't have to support it. So if we can get a maintainer for Drush to do that for us, which I think we will be able to because everybody loves Drush, we'll be able to do that with Drush eventually. We just can't do it today. So today I'm back to like old school, like download the tarball, untar it, put it, copy the files, add them. But that's how I'm going to manage it. I think if people wanted to have that entire Git history, they could. I just feel like that's too much information. It's not really relevant to any given project I'm working on, so I don't include it. But yeah, did that answer the question?
Well, I was asking more about the update server, I guess. Where
okay.
Are you maintaining a separate server for Backdrop to?
Yes.
Okay. And
sure.
So we're going to be maintaining similar to GitHub and Drupal. It's going to be GitHub, Drupal, and Backdrop.
I'm not really sure where the question was in that.
So your update server.
Yes.
Are you going to be like we go to drupal.org/projects, and that's where our Git repo lives.
Yes.
We also have a repo on GitHub. Are we going to have a separate repo for Backdrop, or is Backdrop going to kind of just I guess pull changes on GitHub and pull from that directly, or? Yeah.
So what Backdrop, the update server, will do is we're going to try and figure out some, how Drupal.org has like a packaging script and it adds the version number. We're going to try and do something similar with Backdrop's update server, where it'll be able to pull a version number either from a Git tag. We have an issue in the queue about how we're going to solve this, where a lot of this stuff is still kind of unresolved. But the big picture is that all of the update information will come from GitHub. It'll either be from packaged automatically by GitHub or tagged in the short term, tagged manually by a module maintainer. Like maybe you have to add that version string when you create a version. but we do want it to all come from GitHub and not from Drupal.org. So if you have a module you're running on your site that comes from Drupal.org, it will need to have a GitHub repository in order to get that version information. But those can be synced using that tool that'll say, like, you know, there's a tool that syncs to GitHub from Drupal, and there's a tool that syncs to Drupal from GitHub. So depending on how we want to have that managed, we could have contrib projects that are just auto sync. I mean, that seems a little dangerous, but it could happen.
No, I like that. It's better than maintaining, you know, 5 dozen different repos and having to you know, push every single time. It's kind of a pain. So that
and
definitely.
there are maintainers that right now like prefer to have their Drupal code on GitHub just because they use GitHub all the time. And then there are maintainers that prefer to have their code on Drupal.org but have to have it on GitHub for some client reason or business or whatever. So that's why those two tools already exist. So we're just kind of hoping to leverage what's already out there.
Nice. Sounds good. That's all I have for you.
Sure. Well, thanks for coming and asking questions. Those two in particular are ones that you know, everyone keeps asking over and over again, so it'll be good to have them on the recording. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it is still, you know, we don't exist yet. We won't exist until next Wednesday, and we'll see. And depending on what happens in the community, we can change our minds about stuff too, right? It's like, oh, we think it'll happen this way, but then we watch something happen differently, like, oh, well, that's much better. We should do that. So we'll kind of play it by ear here for the short term. We have some plans, but everything is always subject to change.
Well, good luck with it, and yeah, I look forward to seeing what we can develop here.
Great. Well, thanks
Jen.
for coming, and I'll see you in IRC.
All right, have a good one.
All right.